Good morning. I hope you all had a great week. My week was pure chaos. So on the 4th, I woke up 3:30 like normal. Woke up, did my morning routine, silenced the alarm clock, poured some coffee, cleaned up a bit, made myself less scary to look at. And then I picked up my phone and I saw a little email and it said, "Hey, FYI, there's $95 charged to your credit card on this account." And I'm like, what the heck? I don't have a credit card. And then I thought, I don't have that bank. And then I saw it was from Oregon the week before, and I thought, I'm pretty sure I know where I was, and it was not in Oregon. So I spent the next 3 weeks dealing with identity theft, and the 3 sleepless nights to follow becoming an expert. And in all of my studies over those 3 nights, there was 2 pieces of advice that I just absolutely loved. And they kind of tie in with today's message, so I wanted to share them with you. The first one is from Dave Ramsey, and he says, "Success is only 20% knowledge, and it's 80% behavior." And the other piece of knowledge that I picked up was Zig Ziglar, and he says, "Before making any decision, you should ask yourself, will what I'm about to do bring me closer to my goals, or will it take me further from them?" And it's kind of those pieces of advice, they're kind of so intuitive that we can take them for granted really easily. I mean, we apply them to everything in life, so they kind of seem like common sense, right? Like it's one thing to know how to drive, and then it's another thing to drive well. And it's one thing to know the recipe, but it's another thing to be a good chef. And it's one thing to know the knowledge, and it's another thing to live the wisdom. And I was thinking about that, and we apply that to almost every area of our lives. It's one thing to know what to do, it's another thing to do it well. And yet, when we apply it to salvation, everyone just forgets that dynamic exists. And in fact, I've been in churches where the pastor says that the way we live on earth applies to the way we enjoy heaven, and people lost their minds. They started talking about works versus grace and faithfulness and being saved by the cross, and they were not willing to accept that what we do has some value. And it was just crazy to me. And I see this play out in a lot of churches. It just blows my mind that if I were to stand in most pulpits and say that it's not just about what you know, but how you apply it, there might be some glances. I'm looking for them. If I take it one step further and say that it's not about how much Bible you know, but how you live your life, there might be some bigger glances. And if I were to say that being a good Christian is not just knowing the Bible, but living the Word, there might be some torches. So it just blows my mind that we are so comfortable with that dynamic of applying knowledge to become wise until it gets to the most important knowledge of all. And then we want to pretend that our lives and our actions and behaviors don't matter, right? Like I hear it said a lot, it doesn't matter what I do because I'm saved by grace. And I hear it said a lot, God doesn't judge me for how I live because I'm saved by the cross. And I hear it said a lot that my future doesn't matter as far as accountability goes because everything that matters already happened on the cross and Jesus' resurrection. And like with most problems in the Christian church, That's half true. So I really want to unpack in our last series or sermon of this series what this whole dynamic's all about. Because the half-truth that is cancerous in the church is that we are saved by grace, so our lifestyles don't matter. Or another way to say that is, since Christ died for us on the cross, we're not accountable for the way we live. And I see that and I hear it, and it causes me to be uneasy, and I get shivers, and I don't like it. But that's the message we hear. And that's the message I want to correct, because it's half true. We are saved by grace. The cross is very important. Our grace comes from the cross, and we are covered by grace. There's just more to the story, and the other half is problematic, and we fall into that trap. So one of the most practical pieces of life advice in the entire Bible comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. If you've ever heard life is a race, so run it well, that comes from this verse. 1 Corinthians 9, verses 24 through 27, it says, "Don't you know that you are runners in a race, and you should run it well? And at the same time, only one will receive the prize. So you should instead run as the person who will receive the prize. Every athlete exercises self-restraint in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we do it to receive an imperishable one. So me personally, I do not run aimlessly. I am not like some boxer who boxes against the air. Instead, I discipline my body. I keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I will be disqualified from the prize." So this metaphor of running a race is all about how to live life well. And just like that financial advice is not just about what you know, but how you do it, we're going to see that dynamic play out. Same author, but when he is later describing how to run the race well and live a good life, he gives some of the most important advice throughout the scriptures. We can find it in Philippians chapter 3, verse 12. This verse is right after he describes all the things and all the blessings in his life and how important his faith and grace have been and how far God has brought him. And he says, "Not just that I've already obtained this or that I am perfect, but I press on to make it my own because Jesus Christ has made me his. Brothers," Christians, "I do not consider that I have made it on my own, but one thing I do, I forget what lies behind, straining forward to what lies ahead. I press on for the goal, for the prize, for the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Let those of you who are mature," and he means spiritually mature, so those of us who are emotionally immature, we still have hope. It says, "Those of you that are mature, think this way. And if anything you think otherwise, God will reveal that to you also. Only let us hold true to what we have attained. Brothers, join me and imitate me. Keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us. For many of whom I have often told you and now tell you even with tears in my eyes, they walk as enemies of the they walk as enemies of the cross of Christ, and their end is destruction." So he tells us Life is a race. He tells us to run it well. And then in Philippians, he tells us that the secret to running well is focusing on the finish line. And then in Hebrews 12, he says, run like you're being watched, like people are watching. Hebrews 12, verses 1-3 says, we are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses, and let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run our race with endurance for the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and seated at the right of the throne of God. You know, when I was preparing today's message, my plan was to be very academic and really dive into the theology of glorification and what that entails. I was going to talk about heaven and how beautiful it will be. I was going to talk about that whole process of being resurrected. But I also know from my experience and from the experience of others that the traditional response when we talk about heaven is our audience gets a brief moment of comfort and then they walk away unchanged. And that always astounded me because there's almost like this like unnamed cavalierness when we think about heaven. And I've been guilty of this too. Like the attitude of like, that's in the future, I need to focus on today, right? Like, I don't want my head in the clouds, I want to focus on living well today. Like, heaven's gonna be great, but today's a problem, so I need to get it sorted. Like, that's where my mind was at. I need to live well today and fix the problems. And heaven, I'll let God deal with that. I won't think about that too much because I don't want my head to be in the clouds. I don't want to be too idealistic. And the verses from Paul say the only way to live a good life and to be a good Christian is to continue to focus on the finish line and to run with that in mind. So even if I lived a somewhat acceptable life, like my finances were in order, I was sometimes nice to people, I held down a job, like these secular benchmarks that we have, even if I did all of the right things, if I'm not doing them with Christ and for Christ, I'm not running the race I could be. And I really want, instead of diving super far into the theology of glorification, I really want us to unpack that day, because that's what Paul says to do, is to live every single day with our resurrection in mind. In other words, live every single day picturing what it will be like to enter heaven, and the rest will sort itself out. A lot of people don't know what that day will look like, so that's kind of impossible to picture. And just like those quotes I named earlier, it's once we know it, it's even harder to live it. There was another piece of expert advice when I was becoming a financial expert over the last few days. And it was, if what you're doing does not bring you closer to your goal, you shouldn't be doing it. And yet, how often do we fail to apply that to our eternity? It's hard. And it's so hard because it's easy to get comfortable here. I truly believe in my heart of hearts that the biggest cancer in the Christian church is not sinfulness, it is satisfaction. Like, we are satisfied with our AC and our TVs and our living rooms and our comfy recliners. And because we're so comfortable in the life that we've built, we really don't leverage God too much. We let him come into our lives, but only so far. And we're willing to make sacrifices, but only when they don't take us away from our TV in our living room too long. And we'll be Christians, but as long as we can still have the nice car also. Or we'll be Christians as long as it doesn't take too much of my day. Or we'll be Christians if whatever. And God in the Bible, he says the exact opposite. We can't be comfortable because we don't belong here. The Bible describes us as sojourners, which is a Hebrew word that describes a traveler who's in a foreign land traveling somewhere else, usually traveling home or traveling to a holy site. And the Bible says we are sojourners. It says we come from heaven and we'll return to heaven, and right now on this earth, we're just traveling through. We are called to remember our home in every day. And if we just envision that, like, I could only imagine what the response would be and how different our lives would be. Now, when Zig Ziglar said, if you're doing something that doesn't bring you closer to your goals, stop doing it, he was talking financially. Like, if your goal is to retire as early as possible and you're spending $100 a day on eating out, stop doing that, right? But if we were to apply that same principle to the Bible and ask ourselves every day, is this bringing me closer to Christ? And if not, I'll stop doing it. That would literally be life-changing. And that myth that we're not, like I said, there's a myth in the Christian church, and I mean the larger Christian church. And the myth is, because of grace, we're not judged by works. And some people will even say, because of grace, we're not judged. That's not biblical. Biblically, we are saved by grace. And biblically, if you have grace, you're getting into heaven no matter what. That does not take away from the weight or importance of your lifestyle or the way you've lived or the legacy you leave behind. So there's a dichotomy there of responding to grace and living by works. And if you're interested, we can do a standalone sermon because I really think it's fascinating. But I want to, nowhere to my knowledge does it say that our lifestyles, our actions, our habits, our thoughts, and our words are unimportant. To my knowledge, nowhere in the Bible does it say that we will not be accountable for the way we live or the things we do. Nowhere, to my knowledge, in the Bible does it say that we should not be intentional in our days and in our times and in our response to that grace, just because we are saved by the cross of Christ. In fact, Romans 14, Matthew 2, 2 Corinthians 5, Revelations 20, Hebrews 12, many, many more, they all say the exact opposite. They all say that your lives are important, that the way you live does have value, that you will give an account, that your thoughts and your words and your actions will be brought up in light of eternity. So we're called to run the race well. We're called to run with eternity in mind. And we are called to run like people are watching. So I want to go through what that day will look like, because it's hard to picture something that has not been described to you and that you have not seen. So Revelations 20, verses 11 through 15. Then I saw a great throne and him who was seated upon it. From his presence earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. I saw all of the dead, great and small, standing before that throne. And books were being opened. And then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in those books. This next phrase is really important. Judged by what they had done. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up those who were in them. And they were judged. Each of them judged according to what they had done. Said it a second time. Then death and Hades. Hades, by the way, is the word for the grave in Hebrew. Or in Greek, I mean. Then death and the grave were thrown into the lakes of fire, and this was their second death. And if any of names were not found in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire also. So we are called to envision that because we are going to experience it. And all of those verses that describe giving an account, they were all written to Christians. And they were all written to Christian churches. I'll read them again in case you want to write them down. It's Romans 14, Matthew 12, 2 Corinthians 5, Revelations 20, and Hebrews 12. Revelations 20 and many others, they say that we're judged according to our works, our actions. And verses such as Matthew 5, they say that our thoughts are also worthy of being judged. And verses like Ecclesiastes 3, they mention that our heart and our intentions and our emotional responses are also judged. So, envision standing before a great throne, God seated upon it. Imagine you're getting into heaven no matter what. You're saved by grace, you got a ticket in. Now also envision that before you go in, you give an account for everything you have done and thought, and that will dictate your reward. The reward is mentioned a few times, but it's never described, so we don't know actually what we're getting. And people have all kinds of weird theories. I have no idea, so I'm not going to enlighten you to something I'm still ignorant about. But the important takeaway is you get into heaven because you're saved by grace, and there's nothing you can do to mess that up. Mostly. Secondly, from that, the way you live on earth will dictate the way you live in heaven for eternity. And the way we do it well is we live on earth with eternity in mind. So, in all things, we should be asking ourselves, is this bringing me closer to Christ or further from? Is this a step towards eternity, or is this a step towards comfortability? Is this being done for God and God's glory? Or is this being done because of what I want in the moment? Again, separate from your salvation, you will give an account for the way you live and the way you have lived. And the Bible regularly recommends, envision that day. Picture it. What will it look like? What will you hear? Imagine being at the end of your race, surrounded by witnesses, describing everything you've done. That verse in Hebrews, it says that when we give an account for the things we did well, those witnesses cheer. And when we do give an account for something that we did poorly, a sin or a mistake or a backstep, they weep. Pretend that you can hear that. Envision what that throne will look like. Envision what it will feel like to see God's face for the first time. Once you have that picture, keep it close to your heart and judge everything according to it. Because to live the Christian life well, everything we do, ideally, will bring us closer to God and be for God's glory. And of course, we're imperfect, and no one's going to do that perfectly. But if you're not doing it intentionally, you're not doing it at all. We're never going to hit a bullseye that we don't know where the bullseye is. We have to first locate it. We have to then aim at it. And then we have to take the steps accordingly. So I just exhort and encourage you, picture that day, go throughout the Bible, find the verses that describe it, which are many and plentiful. Think about what it will be like to give an account, what it will feel like to stand there, what it will sound like to hear them their grief and their cheers and their sadness and their victory and their applause and their weeping. Picture what it will be like to be with God forever. And at least according to the Bible, it says that if we do that regularly, consistently, constantly, everything else will fall in line. It's kind of like if you love your spouse, you're not going to cheat, like that kind of thing. If you love God, you're going to respond accordingly. And it's not because of determination or elbow grease. It's just because you get to the place where you love him too much to hurt him so often. And when you get to that place, and when you intentionally live in that place, everything else works itself out. And you run a little better. You run a little faster. You run with direction. And eventually, when the day comes, you finish your race well. And you get to boast in everything you did, not for yourself, but for God's glory. And you get to bask in the love that you demonstrated for him and his son. So despite the myth that our lives don't matter and our actions are inconsequential, the way we live has an impact. And biblically, we should picture that day and ask ourselves, is this bringing me closer to Christ or further from? Is this movie being watched for God's glory? Is my daily routine set up success for God and his kingdom? I would hate to get to the end of my life and say, even though it doesn't show in my life, I loved you. I would hate to have that message. I would hate to be in front of God and say, I know you didn't see it, and I know the people around me didn't feel it, And I know I didn't show it, but deep down I loved you, I promise. I want it to be so obvious and so evident that I love God that there's no question. And hopefully I hear the cheers of the people around me when I walk through the gates.